good morning to everybody. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Chang Pilwa for inviting me to participate in this open forum and the wider two-week program for the Empowerment of Women program. And thank you very much, Professor Lee Sang-Hwa, for that very kind invitation. So what I want to talk about today is a form of women's activism, and try and think about that with you, introduce the ways I've been thinking about that. Yesterday we heard a lot about women's activism, particularly around political mobilisation and the issue of addressing patriarchy, getting voice in communities, getting representation and so on. But today I want to focus more on women's role in economic activism. Of course, it's related to political activism. It's a form of political activism, but I want to focus specifically on the economy. Because as we heard yesterday from Professor Vaughan, challenging capitalism is as important as challenging patriarchy. And capitalism is the way that we often represent our economy. So what I want to do is talk about how we might reframe the economy so that we can be more politically active in challenging it. I want to talk about some of the ways in which we can locate women's activism and use some examples from Asia to do that. And very briefly at the end, I want to talk a bit about what the implications might be for what I'll call post-development. How women are contributing to a very different visioning of what development is. So first of all, let me just talk about the question of reframing, or the process of reframing. Jen Vaughan talked about reframing yesterday a little bit, and might talk a bit more about that in the workshop tomorrow, or the lecture tomorrow. But I think we all recognise that the process of reframing is a very crucial aspect of any kind of social transformation. Well, what do I mean by reframing? This is a classic example. Anyone that's done first year psychology will probably have seen this image. You can see it as a vase to put flowers in, or you can see it as two faces looking at each other. Depending on your perspective, depending on the frame that you put around that image, you will see a very different thing. So there's a figure ground shift, and that's a form of reframing. Well, the most famous and most effective reframing that has happened in the last 100 years is the reframing of how we think about women. And I love this journal that I found many years ago, Balai, I think a Filipino women's journal. On the front cover was the image that we have of women all over the world. Women situated as carers, as water carriers, as food gatherers, as wood gatherers, as food preparers, as laundry maids. And on the back cover of this journal, we have women liberated in all different kinds of roles, as doctors, as builders of houses, yes, still caring for children, but becoming philosophers, historians, educators, lawyers, I think. That's what that mallet's about, a lawyer or a judge. So there has been a very powerful reframing of what it means to be a woman in the last 100, 200 years. It's been an active and an unfinished process of reframing. And that has been a very effective political movement. And as we know, it continues and there's still challenges. But we have to recognise the achievements of feminism in this reframing process. as I said, feminism has reframed how we think about women and what kind of discourses we have around what it means to be a woman. Of course, feminism has also brought to light all sorts of hidden histories, or as feminists would like to call them, her stories, not just the stories of his, of he, all the stories of women that have held up half the world. And Professor Chung mentioned many of these in her opening lecture and our program. So as we know, feminism has liberated women to take up many different roles. And of course, feminism has also produced a very different way of thinking about the world. It's one that puts care and life and interconnection between people and interconnections between people and nature, people and environments on the centre stage. And Jen's talk yesterday really focused on that kind of rethinking that's happened. So my interest is in thinking about what this reframing can do for starting to rethink the economy. The process of reframing brings up new vocabularies, new words, new phrases that have meaning. It opens up new identities, new subjectivities, and then, therefore, it also opens up new possibilities for action. And all of these, of course, lead to social transformation. So I'm interested in what kind of vocabularies we can come up with to start to rethink economies. What new identities emerge when we do that kind of reframing? And then what kind of new action can women be at the forefront of? So I want to talk a little bit about how Julie Graham and I, as our joint author that Professor Lee mentioned, J.K. Gibson Graham, Julie and I met at graduate school in 1977, and we started working together straight away and writing papers together. And we continued, even though she was living in the US and I went back to live in Australia. Over 30 years we continued to work together until she died in 2010. But in that time we developed a whole network of community economy researchers, our students and our students' students. So the work of J.K. Gibson Graham is continuing in many different forms. But when we first started to work together, and we didn't put our names together till in the early 90s, I think under the influence of postmodernism and feminist kind of what I would call in Australia larrikinism, which is a kind of playfulness, we thought we would play around with this notion of authorship, the single author, which was usually the single male author. So we played around with that and put our names together. But what we started to do was to think about development in a different way. Increasingly, we came to see that we really needed to reframe the notion of development away from this single vision that development equaled economic growth. And our reframing of development is really to focus on a different kind of growth. Not just growth of GDP and economic productivity in a very confined definition, but the growth of well-being, the growth of peace, the growth of resilience. The growth of a development, an idea of development that honours interdependence rather than honouring only getting ahead, the individual getting ahead through economic growth, which is, I think, the overarching kind of motivation that seems to lie behind this vision of development as purely economic growth. And here, of course, we are very encouraged by countries like Bhutan that have been able to, again, rethink the kind of indices, the indexes by which we measure progress. They're focusing on forms of well-being, forms of happiness. This is part of a growing interest worldwide in rethinking what do we mean by development, because the kind of development we've been behind, we've seen over the last 100, 150 years has achieved much, but it's also destroyed much. And the kind of level of degradation of our environment and destruction of social relations is getting to the point where we realise, as a human species, we can't go on like this. So our work has really contributed to this kind of reframing and rethinking of development, and it's an ongoing process. What stands in the way of a rethinking of development is this monster called capitalism. It's a representation of an economic system that has encompassing power. Every location in the world has been affected, we are told, by capitalism. It's affected by the way we portray the dynamics of this system, this inexorable move towards a certain kind of marketisation, commodification, exploitation, all the Asians. This idea of a machine that's just kind of grinding along. And of course, what we see in that representation is capitalism having the power of agency. That is the driving force of change. And in the face of that, we're just cowering communities, women, having to fit in somehow. Now, that is a representation, that is a framing of the economy, and that's what Julie and I started to challenge. We started to reframe what this machine economy, with the men pulling the levers, you know, when the machine suddenly starts to break down, like through the financial crisis in the 2008, suddenly we have to have a government stepping in to pull a lever and let a bit more money out or save the corporations. So this vision of an economy that's a machine, but somehow the machine sometimes breaks down and then we can step in and fix it and then the machine gets going again. This is what we're trying to challenge, and we're trying to reframe the way we think about our economic identity, the identity of the economy we live in, and the dynamics, what drives this system. So we wrote a book in the 1990s called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It. I'm focusing here on the way we represent capitalism. And as you can see, the subtitle was a feminist critique of political economy, which is a play on the subtitle of Marx's Capital, which was a critique of political economy. So the image that Blackwell publishers thought to put on the front of that book, and they're very kind of Germanic and very serious looking book, in those colours, it looks like something out of a Marxist political party. The image was of Sisyphus, the story of Sisyphus rolling this huge rock up the top of the hill, just as though we took a rock and tried to take it up to the herbarium at Ewha campus, and that rock would just keep rolling back down again. We'd have to roll it back up. That was the vision they had, and we could see that was capitalism. We keep trying to re-theorise it in order to get out of it, but it just keeps rolling back down and squashing us. I much prefer, though, the image that the Turks, in the Turkish translation of The End of Capitalism, came up with for the same book. Here, they took an old environmental poster with machine capitalism. There's the machine cogs going around in the middle, churning up houses and lives. And there's the earth being eaten and the smoke coming out. And here we have Julie and I. I'm not sure how many of you know the story of David and Goliath from the Bible, the Old Testament. It's the story of a giant as at the head of an army, and David, as a young man, a young boy, goes out only with a slingshot, and he manages to kill the giant. It's the story of David and Goliath. So somehow they humorously made Julie and I into little girl Davids. using our slingshots to try and bring this machine down. So how did we try and do that? What were our slingshots? Well, really, a very simple image explains what we tried to do. What we started to realise was that all the practices, the economic practices that support life, that produce material goods and services, take place in many different locations. And the kind of economic practices that economists and economic theory focuses on are purely these activities that are above the waterline in this image of an iceberg. Economic theory focuses on wage employment, people working for money and under certain circumstances of no access to means of production. They focus on production for a market, they focus on commodification and the transaction of goods and services in formal markets, and they focus largely on capitalist firms, firms that are privately owned and which the wealth that's generated in those enterprises is privately appropriated. But that's not what keeps the world going. What keeps the world going is all sorts of other kinds of work, all kinds of other sorts of transactions, forms of wealth generation and sharing. So underneath the waterline in this iceberg economy are a whole lot of practices, places, people doing work that are usually excluded from our vision or our representation of what the economy is. So with this kind of vision, we started to produce a different representation, which we call diverse economies. So rather than just focusing on wage labour, market transactions, and capitalist enterprise, we started to draw on all the work that was done by anthropologists, by feminists, by informal sector, people that study the informal sector, to show there's many different ways that people work and receive some kind of remuneration or work in an unpaid situation, and they yet produce all sorts of goods and services that keep us living. And I've just listed some of those there. And of course, feminist theorists have been very important in showing the role that housework and volunteer labour plays in any economy. Similarly, we can see that the formal market of transactions of goods as commodities is accompanied by many other kinds of transactions that are also taking place in markets, but where other considerations, other than just, I'll get the best price from you, take place. So fair trade networks, alternative currencies, barter networks, and underground markets. And let me just say at this point that this diversity, this inventory of diversity, is looking at everything. As you can see, I've got slave labour down there. We know slavery is still part of our everyday life. This is not a projection of what we would like to see in the world. It's just an inventory of what does coexist. So when we think about enterprise, there's many different kinds of enterprises that are alternative, that try to generate wealth and distribute it in different ways, not just to personal, private, to particular wealthy people. Obviously, state-owned business can do that sometimes. Socially responsible business, not-for-profits, also try not to generate surplus, or if they do, it only goes back into the enterprise. And there's many kinds of non-capitalist enterprises where very different discussions and negotiations take place about what kind of wealth is generated and how it's distributed. Similarly, we can think about property not only as private property and mainstream finance. We can look at all the different kinds of ways that people access and own property or relate to open access resources, and all the different ways that people access finance in ways where different ethics, rather than getting the highest interest rate, might operate. And of course, there's many non-market ways of investing and gathering resources to invest in futures, which are forms of finance. So this kind of reframing of economy has been useful in many different contexts. In the Pacific, in Melanesia, in the Solomon Islands, we've used this kind of reframing to help people understand that they are part of an economy. This is instead of a floating iceberg, because we were working in the tropics, we thought of using a floating coconut. And on this diverse economy inventory, we've separated out what women were doing and what men were doing. And again, showing that the proportion of women and men in the so-called formal economy, the capitalist economy that the economists focus on all the time, is very minimal. Most people are doing all sorts of other things in the non-cash economy, in the informal sector, in households and in communities. So, we'll talk a bit about that tomorrow, even more. But the issue is now, what does that mean for locating economic activism? What difference does it make to reframe the economy in that way? So I want to just quickly talk about some examples of economic activism. So when we think about women's economic activism, we often think about women supporting men in the real economy. And the classic example, I think, in sociological studies is the image of the miner's wife. Many of you probably don't remember the famous miners' strikes in the UK in the 1980s when the Thatcher government was privatising all of the state coal mines. And the wives of miners, that's a picture of them, were very vocal. They weren't miners themselves, but they were out there on the picket lines, protesting to make a change. So women's economic activism has always taken one role of supporting men, but often it's seen as supporting men in the real economy. Women come out with their pots and pans and go and help men do their economic activism, and you wonder often what the outcome is for women. Of course, women are also involved in fighting for their own rights, their own workers' rights, and many examples throughout Asia have come to mind of women organising, particularly in clothing manufacturing, in electronics, to get fair wages, fair working conditions. So this kind of economic activism is very much the kind of usual form. It's about arguing and mobilising to be able to get fair wages, fair conditions, so that we can survive well. Why do we work? We work to survive. Many people work as wage labourers, where many women do, and economic activism there is still very important. But my interest is in not just the economic activism around these relationships of wages and corporations, but all the kinds of activism that takes place under this waterline in the diverse economy. So, for instance, we can see women very much organising around the issue of fair work and wages for all forms of indentured labour. And one of the groups that's been most important here has been the organising of domestic workers who work not for capitalist corporations, they work in people's households, usually under a contract that's like a contract of indenture. They're not free to come and go as they please. They're only free to have one day off a week. They often sleep in the kitchen or in a room just off a kitchen, very small. Very few rights. And this struggle has been going on for many years. Those pictures were taken in the early 1990s in Hong Kong. And just recently I visited Hong Kong again, and still I see domestic workers on their days off sitting in public spaces. It was raining when I was in Hong Kong. They were all in the covered walkways with cardboard boxes, making little living rooms for themselves, sitting on the floor as the tourists all picked their way through, cooking, eating, making crafts, calling home, having some private space in public space. So the issues for having a fair and working life are still very alive, but they're still a focus of very very intense economic activism. Another form of economic activism, I think, happens all the world over in agriculture, particularly in self-employed or smallholder agriculture. One case that I've been involved in a number of years ago now is the case of smallholder farmers in Papua New Guinea in the oil palm industry. And I won't go into the issues around oil palm, which we might have heard from yesterday if our Indonesian sister had been here, but it's a very problematic industry, but it is one in Papua New Guinea that has afforded many people access to cash incomes. Of course, the problem is smallholders have their own little plot of oil palm. They harvest the oil palm. It's sitting there waiting to be picked up by the corporation. The farmer gets the payment, gets the check, and what happens to it? It gets frittered away, often in all sorts of expenditures that don't support the family. So in Papua New Guinea, a very interesting form of women's activism has emerged, where women, in collaboration with the corporations, have argued for their own payment. And now they collect, instead, in the past, most women gave up on agriculture, on oil palm. They decided, I'm not going to help my husband. He never gives me any money. What's the point? And so the company thought, well, we can actually increase productivity if women were involved here. So they decided to separate the payments. And they introduced what they call the loose fruit mama card. So women would get paid separately than men. And they'd get paid separately for collecting the loose fruit, the fruit that drops off, which of course has the higher proportion of oil in it. And this loose fruit mama project has made major impacts in the well-being of families in these regions of Papua New Guinea, because as the world over we know, when women have cash, they buy mattresses, pots and pans, they pay the school fees, they pay the medical bills. The improvement of life has been dramatic, just with this small change of an accounting practice, which was a collaboration between women and the corporation. And of course, that notion that women are more responsible is something that the development industry has got onto, and women have become now the focus of so much development intervention because of their responsibility, their sense of care, their sense of interconnection. Let me now talk about two other kinds of economic activism, which aren't so focused about generating nor cash income or sharing it within the household, but are about trying to organise different ways of doing enterprise, ways that will generate wealth and distribute surplus in new ways. And one of them that I was involved in was a group of older women in the Philippines, and this is in Hagna in Bohol, who decided to draw on local assets and their organising skills to develop their own community enterprise. So this is not sole proprietorship, it's not self-employment, it's not a cooperative, it's an association of women who decided that they had access to very good physical resources, to the ginger that the farmers were producing that didn't have markets. They had the skill to produce what they call salabat. It's a ginger tea. They grind up the ginger, they mix it with sugar, and then they reduce it down into a powder. And they've started their own enterprise with a local market, local resources, and interestingly, from my point of view, they are building on the assets of the area, they're building on interconnections, and they're building on the diverse economy of the region. Part of what they draw on is reciprocal labour exchange. If one of the elderly women is sick, one day when they're doing production, that family will send another member of the family in to do the work instead. They draw on their own patronage networks. They'll sell their salabat to people, and if that family doesn't have the money for the moment, they'll still give it to them and then come back later and pick up the money. They know that they have a network of people that they are related to, that they can trust. They have in-kind payments. Everyone brings some food to the production day. They sit down and have lunch together. and so that's part of the payment of doing the work. But all of them have developed supplementary income. Most of them are also farmers. They're living in a semi-subsistence environment. The supplementary income helps them to get new glasses, pay medical bills, but most importantly, they've started to generate wealth, to generate surplus that they put back into the community. And one of their main priorities is to spin off new enterprises using ginger, using other local products that will employ young women, so that the young women don't feel that they have to leave the town, go and work in Hong Kong as a domestic worker, leaving their own children so that they can go and look after someone else's child, just to get some money to pay for school fees or medical fees. So their interest as older women is to develop new economic activities that younger women can be involved in that will start to stop this drain of young people, of talent out of the rural area. Now, of course, this is a very small instance, a very small enterprise, but we can also look to, just before I move on, this enterprise is drawing on all sorts of different aspects of the diverse economy. It's a community enterprise. It's drawing on kind of forms of fair trade, of forms of barter, and forms of reciprocal labour and in-kind payment. So you can see that this inventory helps us to unpack and look at the kind of activism that women can be involved in to create more ethical economic relationships. And these community enterprises are very much like the social enterprises that here in Seoul are also growing and are being supported by the mayor. There's a whole growth all over the world in what I'll call social or community enterprises that have a social goal or an environmental goal at their core. As I said, this is quite a small example, but we could look to much larger examples of women taking on enterprise and developing different kinds of enterprise. And one of the examples that we've been inspired by is Sewa's Trade Facilitation Centre. Many of you have probably heard of the Self-Employed Women's Association, which has been going since the early 70s in India. But more recently, they've started a new not-for-profit craft business, which actually accesses an international market. It's producing crafted clothes, using the skills of women in northern India, in the Gujarat region. But interestingly, the enterprise is owned by the workers themselves. They're all shareholders. Any surplus gets fed back into wages, into expanding the numbers of people who are employed. And this is, we're operating at a large scale. 15,000 households in northern India are being supported by the kind of incomes generated in this sector. And these are the kind of fashion items that women have started to produce and sell. So here we see a form of a worker-owned business, a worker cooperative. It's accessing international markets. It's paying people a just cooperator's wage, and it's distributing surplus within the enterprise and out to households in the region. So what I'm interested in is reframing economies as spaces for ethical action, for caring for others, for accepting our interdependence with each other, not just with people locally, but distant others, people who live in other parts of the world, and with our environments. And so the idea of a community economy is one that focuses in on the questions of surviving well rather than just work for work's sake, on distributing surplus rather than making profits for private gain, on ethical encounters with others rather than just market relationships that are faceless, in which we try and get the most out of the least. And when we come to thinking about property, we're interested in the process of commoning. When we think about finance, we're interested in investing in futures and, of course, consuming sustainably. I haven't had the time to go through the kinds of activism we can see around these other dimensions of a community economy. I've just talked about activism around surviving well together and distributing surplus. But the more we look at women's economic activism in this wider landscape of diverse economies, the more we can see that women are participating in a very different kind of development. And all I can say is that what we're doing here is shifting, I think, from one pathway to growth, which has been the image of, capitalist development, the kind of stages of development that economic development theorists keep telling us are the way to the future, and it'll float all boats, everyone will finally get something. We know that doesn't work. What we're interested in is many pathways towards well-being, peace, and resilience, and key to that is the idea of interconnection and how we ethically act upon our interconnection within the economy. So the latest book that I've written with my colleagues that was started before Julie died is called Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities. And I think that women's economic activism is doing this, but we have to reframe the economy. We have to open our eyes in a different way, and we have to develop the skills to see the different ways that people are negotiating and mobilising and activating ethics of care and interconnection. And anyone that's interested in reading more about this can look at the website that was also mentioned before, the communityeconomies.org website. Thank you.